Mr. Chairman, the story of this national government's transport policy deserves to be told, and it goes something like this. This government, under Stephen Joyce's leadership as a Transport Minister in its early years, took the transport budget, which amounts to about $3.5 billion a year, and decided to politicise it and treat it as a party political slush fund for the National Party. That's what they did. It was an act of supreme cynicism, and they made the decision against the advice of officials, against the advice of all of the best benefit cost ratios, all of the analysis, and decided to pour billions of dollars into a handful of hand-picked motorway projects that hadn't even been subject to the most basic economic analysis when this government committed the money for those projects. A handful of urban motorway projects. It was pork barrel politics on an industrial scale. And that is the defining quality of this government's transport policy. The result of that has been that every other category of the transport budget, whether it's urban public transport or local roads in regional New Zealand, have been cut and squeezed and neglected for the last 7 years. This government has been willing to run down and neglect a multi-billion-dollar asset that belongs to the people of this country in the form of the local roads and state highways. They've been content to neglect the transport needs of our country's biggest city, making themselves, this national government, a brake on Auckland's economic growth and prosperity. We did the figures when the government policy statement on transport came out, and then again when the National Land Transport Fund came out. And what those numbers show, Mr. Chairman, is that for regional New Zealand, outside of the main urban centres, spending on roads has dropped by 13% in real terms between 2008 and 2013. That amounts to a real cut of $163 million. That is a reduction in the spending on local and regional roads by this national government during their 7 years in office so far. 13% cut in real terms. What's the upshot? The consequence of that cut in funding to regional New Zealand's roads is that the roads themselves fall into disrepair and pose a threat to the safety of people using those roads in regional New Zealand. And this national government, having blamed councils all around New Zealand for the last 7 years for being profligate spenders, all this government's transport policy has done is load more and more pressure onto the ratepayers in regional New Zealand. And take Southland, Mr. Chairman, about 10,000 ratepayers. They've had a massive dairying boom there over the last decade or so. They have the largest roading network outside of the Auckland supercity, and yet they have had successive cuts to their local road funding. And Eric Roy, the former member for Invercargill, was in the Southland Times explaining to his constituents why their road funding was cut by this national government. And he was very candid. That's what I liked about Eric Roy. And he said, until we've built all the roads of national significance, the roads in Southland are just going to have to wait. And that is a message, sir, that he could have delivered to any town, any community throughout this country, because that's been the effect of this government's transport policy on regional New Zealand. The regions are missing out. If you look at average funding per person, nationwide the average is $648 per person. In the regions it's only $566 per person. Per kilometre, nationwide there's an average spend of $11,430 under national. That has, in the regions, that is only $9,230. The regions are getting done like a dog's dinner under national. The second thing I wanted to say is that in the last election, as we have repeatedly seen from this government, they are dragged kicking and screaming, they are embarrassed publicly, and then finally they throw a bone to try to keep people quiet, and they announce $212 million of regional road funding. But the following year in the budget, they only allocated $97 million for those roads. But they promised $212 million. Now, how cynical can you get? We saw this, speaking of cynicism, with the bridges of Northland. A blatant pork barrel promise that Minister won't deliver on.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Thanks for the opportunity.